The night air was thick with smoke. Torches flickered in the hands of a jeering crowd. At the center of it all sat a man who was no king, yet was dressed as one. His head bore a crown, his shoulders the robe of a monarch, and his body was pinned to a throne by nails driven deep through flesh and bone. He could not move. He could not fight. He could only stare back at those who mocked him, the executioners, the rulers, and the citizens who had gathered to watch. Moments later, the wood beneath him was set ablaze. Flames roared upward, devouring his garments, his body, and the throne itself. His screams pierced the night, but they were drowned out by the sound of crackling fire and the laughter of men who believed they were not simply killing a slave, but extinguishing the very idea that anyone like him could ever dare rise to power. This was no ordinary execution. It was theater. It was humiliation. It was the destruction of both body and identity. The man's name was Pelorus, or Pelorius, as some sources remember him. A slave of Carthaginian origin, his story was passed down by Roman and Greek writers who were themselves horrified by its cruelty. His death was not just an act of vengeance, it was a ritual of mockery. By nailing him to a throne and crowning him as a king, his captors sought to turn his final moments into a twisted parody of power. To rule, they implied, was nothing more than to suffer on a seat of fire. This was the ancient world, a place where executions were rarely private and rarely simple. Death itself was transformed into spectacle. Rulers understood the psychology of terror. They knew that to control the living, one must first dehumanize the dying. In Sicily, Carthage, and Rome, executions were public rituals, and slaves were their most common victims. Yet even in a time of crucifixions, floggings, and gladiatorial slaughter, the death of Pelorus stood apart. It shocked contemporaries not only for its cruelty, but for its symbolism. He was not just killed, he was made into a symbol of shame, a warning carved into memory through fire. But why did this happen? Who ordered it? And what were they trying to prove? Some sources point to Phalaris of Acragas, the infamous tyrant remembered for his brazen bull, a torture device in which victims were roasted alive inside a hollow brass statue. Others suggest his successors, men of equal ruthlessness, who understood that fear was more powerful than mercy. Whoever stood behind it, the intention was clear. Power was not just about swords or soldiers. It was about theater, about ritual, about controlling desire and terror in equal measure. And so we begin our journey into one of history's darkest corners. A story not just of one slave's fate, but of the psychology of power itself. How ancient rulers weaponized humiliation, sexuality, and death to maintain control. In the minutes to come, we will peel back the layers of history, revealing how taboo practices, forbidden rituals, and shocking executions shaped the world we inherited. Because in this story, as in so many others, the true horror is not that one man died on a throne of fire, but that the crowd applauded. In the ancient world, power was never expressed solely through armies, wealth, or temples. It was also carved into the intimate spaces of life, into the bedroom, the banquet hall, and the slave quarters. To rule another human being meant not only to command their labor, but to own their body. And to humiliate them was to remind everyone else of their place in the hierarchy. Slavery was the perfect stage for this dynamic. A slave's body was not their own. It was an extension of their master's will. A master could order a slave to farm, to fight, to serve food, or to serve flesh. Submission was expected, resistance unthinkable. And yet, it was precisely in the realm of intimacy that rulers and elites showed their most brutal creativity. In Rome, it was common for wealthy men to keep slave concubines, both male and female. These weren't relationships of affection, they were demonstrations of ownership. The act itself was not about love or desire, but about hierarchy. To take someone sexually was to declare, "You are beneath me. You are property." Ancient satirists, and moralists recorded these abuses with a mix of disgust and resignation, because everyone knew they were happening. But Rome was not alone. In Carthage and Sicily, the lands where Pelorus met his fate, the same principles applied. Rulers flaunted their mistresses and male companions as symbols of power, while the common people whispered about scandals they dared not challenge. Tyrants often blurred the line between court ritual and sexual domination. The victim's body became a tool of propaganda, and this is where control takes its most insidious form. Sexuality was not only about gratification, it was about humiliation. To force intimacy upon someone was to brand them as lesser, to strip them of dignity in front of others. This is why the execution of Pelorus was so cruelly staged. Dressing him as a king was not simply irony, it was a ritual of degradation. It mocked the most exalted role in society and forced a slave to embody it in agony. Desire and death were fused into one act of dominance. Psychologists today would call this eroticized power, the blending of pleasure, cruelty, and control. In the courts of tyrants, this was normalized. A concubine one day, a burned slave the next. Both were bound by the same logic. Rulers could reshape bodies at will, whether for pleasure or punishment. The ordinary people, of course, viewed this with unease. Some gasped in horror, others whispered disapproval, but none dared act. In a world where a man could be nailed to a throne for spectacle, who would risk speaking against the powerful? The silence of the masses was part of the ritual itself. Their fear was the tyrant's greatest reward. And so, intimacy became another battlefield of power. Just as soldiers were conquered on the field, slaves and concubines were conquered in the chamber. For tyrants, this was not a contradiction. It was the very essence of control, the ability to take, to degrade, to burn, and to laugh while doing it. The story of Pelorus, or Pelorius, as some sources record him, is one of the most grotesque executions in the long catalogue of ancient cruelty. A slave by birth, Carthaginian by origin, his life was worth little in the eyes of those who ruled Sicily, and yet, in death, he became something more, a symbol, a warning, a grotesque parody of kingship. The sources vary on who ordered the execution. Some point to the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas, a man whose name became synonymous with sadistic brutality. Phalaris is remembered above all for the brazen bull, a hollow bronze statue in which victims were roasted alive, their screams echoing like the bellow of a beast. Others argue it was his successors in Sicily, rulers equally committed to instilling terror. But whether Phalaris himself or one of the men who followed him, the purpose was unmistakable: to transform execution into spectacle. Pelorus was dragged before a crowd. His captors had chosen not to flog him, not to crucify him, but to elevate him, mockingly, to the role of king. They placed upon his head a crown, a symbol of dignity twisted into ridicule. They clothed him in the garments of royalty, robes that would soon be consumed by fire. And then, in one of history's most perverse rituals, they forced him onto a throne. But this was no seat of honor. The throne was an instrument of death. His hands and feet were nailed into place, the iron spikes driven through flesh and wood alike. He could not rise. He could not resist. He was a king only in the eyes of mockery, a slave transformed into a monarch for the sole purpose of being destroyed. The fire was lit. Flames licked the base of the throne, climbing higher, until the figure of Pelorus was engulfed in smoke and heat. The crowd looked on, some jeering, some silent, perhaps even some horrified, as the parody of royalty burned before them. His cries, raw and human, were drowned out by the roar of the blaze. His body convulsed, pinned to the mock throne, until flesh itself could no longer hold. Why this cruel theatre? Historians believe it was a political statement. By crowning a slave and burning him alive, the tyrant sent a clear message. This is what happens when the lowly aspire to rule. The throne itself, symbol of legitimacy and order, was transformed into a tool of annihilation. To be king, in that moment, was to suffer the most horrific death imaginable. The scandal of this execution spread far beyond Sicily. Roman writers later recounted it with disgust, holding it up as evidence of tyrannical excess. Even in an age that accepted crucifixion, public floggings, and gladiatorial slaughter, this act stood out as extraordinary in its depravity. For it was not merely death, it was mockery made flesh, spectacle made fire. And so Pelorus entered history, not as a ruler, not as a rebel, but as a warning. His fate illustrates how ancient tyrants blurred the line between politics and theatre, between execution and ritual. In the end, his throne was not built to elevate, but to consume. The execution of Pelorus was not an isolated cruelty, it was part of a larger pattern that defined the courts of tyrants, where power was never limited to armies and decrees, but seeped into the most intimate corners of life. Behind the walls of palaces and temples, rulers wielded seduction, humiliation, and desire as weapons sharper than any sword. In the Hellenistic world, court politics often revolved around mistresses and concubines. Tyrants flaunted their lovers openly, not only as companions, but as trophies of conquest. To possess a rival's wife or daughter was a political victory. To take a slave as a concubine was a performance of dominance. The line between private indulgence and public statement vanished. Every kiss, every embrace, every whispered scandal had political weight. Consider Syracuse, the great city-state of Sicily. Its tyrants, from Dionysius to Agathocles, were infamous not only for their cruelty, but for their appetites. Agathocles himself was accused of taking pleasure in humiliating nobles, reducing them to objects of his desire, and parading their shame as proof of his supremacy. Court favorites could rise overnight from obscurity to influence, not because of wisdom or valor, but because of the tyrant's bedchamber. But just as swiftly, they could fall, discarded or destroyed once their usefulness ended. This was the dangerous dance of political intimacy. Power gained in the sheets could just as easily lead to ruin. A mistress could whisper secrets that reshaped alliances. A concubine might be the silent witness to treachery. A slave lover might be forced to betray both body and loyalty, knowing that refusal meant death. Religion, too, was entangled in this web. Carthaginian ritual practices, whispered about with horror by Greek and Roman writers, often blended the sacred with the taboo. Some ceremonies invoked fertility through acts that crossed boundaries of decency, reinforcing the idea that intimacy could be harnessed as a form of control, not only over individuals, but over the very destiny of a city. While the truth of these accounts is debated, their existence reveals how contemporaries perceived the link between sexuality and power. Dangerous, corrupting, yet irresistible. It is within this world of intrigue that Pelorus's execution makes even darker sense. By crowning a slave and burning him alive, the tyrant was not just punishing a man. He was staging a performance that touched on every nerve of society. Kingship, slavery, humiliation, and desire all collided in one horrific spectacle. The message to his court was clear. Loyalty was demanded not only in politics, but in the most personal realms of life. Defy me, desire what is forbidden, and you too will burn. These were not abstract ideas. They played out in whispered scandals, in betrayals carried out by lovers, in conspiracies that began not in council chambers, but in bedrooms. A single affair could topple a nobleman. A single humiliation could silence a rival. Power was intimate, and intimacy was political. And so, the fate of Pelorus was part of a larger system. A system where rulers turned the human body into both a throne and a battlefield. For the rulers who staged them, executions like that of Pelorus were performances of power. But for the common people, the farmers, the merchants, the slaves who filled the markets of Sicily and Carthage, these spectacles carried a different weight. They were not simply entertainment. They were warnings carved into memory, reminders of where one stood in a rigid hierarchy. Daily life in the ancient Mediterranean was shaped by inequality. The elites indulged in excess, lavish feasts, sexual intrigues, private chambers filled with slaves whose roles blurred between servant and concubine. For ordinary men and women, survival was the only priority. They worked the fields, paid their taxes, and prayed to gods who offered little protection from the whims of tyrants. And yet, even in the most private aspects of life, marriage, intimacy, family, the shadow of power loomed large. Among the elite, marriage was rarely about love. It was a transaction, cementing alliances between powerful families. A wife might be treated as a political pawn, her fidelity demanded while her husband indulged freely with concubines and slaves. Among common people, the bonds of marriage were closer to partnership. But even here, gender roles were enforced with brutal clarity. A woman who strayed faced punishment. A man who did the same was rarely condemned. Slaves lived in a harsher reality still. Their bodies were not their own. A master might command sexual submission as casually as he commanded labor. Women bore children who belonged to the household, not to them. Boys might be groomed as catamites, forced into intimacy. That blurred the line between abuse and ritual. For them, desire was never a choice. It was an imposition. The cultural double standard was absolute. What was shameful for the free was permitted, even expected, for the enslaved. Executions like that of Pelorus reminded everyone of the ultimate truth. The powerful controlled not only life and death, but also dignity itself. If a slave could be mocked as a king and burned alive, then no one was safe from humiliation. The spectacle reinforced obedience, silencing rebellion not just through fear of death, but through fear of being stripped of humanity before the crowd. And yet, the whispers never fully disappeared. Commoners told stories of tyrants' excesses, weaving them into folklore that carried both horror and condemnation. Some spoke of Phalaris as a monster whose cruelty would be punished by the gods. Others recounted the fate of slaves like Pelorus as cautionary tales, proof that even the lowliest could become symbols in the theater of tyranny. These stories passed from generation to generation, shaping how ordinary people viewed power, not as a noble duty, but as a dangerous force that devoured both rulers and the ruled. Thus, daily life in Sicily, Carthage, and Rome was haunted by a paradox. Intimacy could mean comfort and connection for some, but for others, it was a tool of subjugation. Marriage could unite families, but it could also disguise betrayal. An execution was never simply punishment, it was ritual. A reminder to the masses that their bodies, their desires, their very identities were subject to forces far beyond their control. Every system of power built on fear eventually discovers its limits. Tyrants believe that cruelty is endless, that the masses will accept humiliation, that the crowd will keep watching in silence. But history shows us again and again, there is always a breaking point. The story of Pelorus, the slave mocked as a king and burned alive, was meant to terrify, and for a time, it worked. Those who witnessed it would never forget the image of a man crowned in agony, his cries rising with the flames. But cruelty does not only silence, it corrodes. It plants seeds of hatred, of resentment, of rebellion. In Sicily, tyrants like Phalaris discovered this truth too late. His reign was one of blood and spectacle, infamous for the brazen bull, a device so sadistic it became a legend in its own right. But cruelty breeds enemies, and enemies breed conspiracies. According to ancient sources, Phalaris himself was overthrown, and in a twist of poetic justice, he was executed in the very bull he had commissioned. Whether myth or truth, the story reveals how contemporaries saw the logic of tyranny. Excess eventually devours its master. Elsewhere, rulers who indulged in scandal and humiliation found their courts unraveling from within. Mistresses whispered secrets to rivals. Concubines betrayed their masters. Favorites abandoned tyrants when fortunes shifted. The same intimacy that once secured loyalty became a weapon of destruction. In Rome, emperors like Caligula and Nero learned that unchecked, Indulgence could destabilize entire regimes. Their scandals, sexual, political, and theatrical, turned senators, soldiers, and citizens alike against them. Religion, too, sharpened the backlash. As new philosophies spread, Stoicism in Rome, and later Christianity, the excesses of tyranny came to be seen not only as politically dangerous, but as morally obscene. Philosophers denounced rulers who treated human beings as objects of pleasure and ridicule. Priests and moralists condemned executions staged as mock rituals. Slowly, cultural winds began to shift. What had once been accepted as the privilege of power was now questioned as the corruption of it. The turning point, then, was not a single rebellion or law. It was a change in consciousness. When cruelty and taboo practices reached their peak, people began to see them not as demonstrations of power but as signs of weakness. A ruler who needed to burn a slave on a throne to maintain control was not strong, but desperate. A king who turned intimacy into humiliation revealed his fear more than his supremacy. The downfall of tyrants like Phalaris, the scandals that toppled emperors, and the whispers of rebellion among the people all reveal the same truth: excess has limits. The very rituals designed to enforce obedience became proof of a system rotting from within. And so, the execution of Pelorus meant to frighten, to silence, to glorify the tyrant, instead became part of a larger narrative. It reminded future generations not only of cruelty's power, but also of its inevitable collapse. Because history has no throne for fear. In the end, the fire consumes the master as surely as it consumes the slave. The flames that consumed Pelorus died out in a single night, but the echoes of his death lingered for centuries. His execution was never just about one man, one slave, or even one tyrant. It became part of a pattern that shaped how ancient societies understood power, cruelty, and legitimacy. For the ancients themselves, stories like his served as moral warnings. Roman writers retold them to illustrate the dangers of unrestrained tyranny. Diodorus Siculus, Valerius Maximus, and others used such examples to argue that rulers who mocked human dignity eventually paid the price. In their telling, the execution of a slave on a throne of fire was not a display of strength, but a symptom of corruption, proof that the line between majesty and monstrosity had been crossed. Politically, spectacles like these hardened divisions between rulers and the ruled. Tyrants believed that fear was enough to keep subjects loyal. But each act of public humiliation deepened resentment, eroding the fragile trust that held societies together. A ruler who turned executions into theatre might silence rebellion in the short term, but in the long run, he fostered a culture of paranoia. Those closest to him, courtiers, mistresses, even family members, became potential traitors, waiting for their chance to turn cruelty back against its master. Culturally, the consequences were equally profound. Tales of grotesque punishments spread across the Mediterranean, shaping how neighboring peoples viewed one another. Greeks and Romans pointed to Carthage and Sicily as lands of excess, branding them barbaric, even as they practiced their own forms of cruelty. In this way, Pelorus's death became part of a cultural propaganda war, reinforcing stereotypes that justified conquest and domination. Rome could claim the moral high ground, even while it nailed men to crosses by the thousands. Religiously, the impact stretched further still. Later, philosophers and Christian writers seized on stories like Pelorus's to condemn pagan brutality. They framed such acts as evidence of a world in desperate need of moral reform. To them, the burning of a slave on a throne was not just a political crime, but a spiritual one, proof of humanity's fallen state. In medieval sermons, echoes of these tales resurfaced, serving as cautionary examples of what happens when rulers forget the divine laws of justice and mercy. Archaeology adds another layer. Excavations in Sicily and North Africa reveal altars, execution sites, and remnants of ritual objects that suggest death was often staged as spectacle. While we cannot pinpoint Pelorus's throne in the earth, the broader material culture confirms what the texts describe. Societies where power, ritual, and death were intimately bound. In the long run, Pelorus's fate became more than just a footnote. It symbolized the extremes of power, how far rulers would go to terrify, and how deeply such acts scarred the collective memory of civilizations. His burning throne was a warning to future ages. Power that humiliates and destroys does not last. The body may be consumed, but the story endures, reshaping how cultures understand authority, cruelty, and resistance. The story of Pelorus, a slave nailed to a throne, crowned in mockery, and burned alive, is more than a fragment of ancient cruelty. It is a mirror, held up across centuries, forcing us to confront the darkest aspects of human power. His execution reminds us that authority has always flirted with spectacle, that humiliation has long been a tool of control, and that the line between ritual and brutality is thinner than we like to believe. In the ancient world, such acts were not isolated aberrations. They were systemic. Tyrants used them to terrify populations. Priests rationalized them with ritual. Crowds accepted them, sometimes even cheered them, because survival meant complicity. Yet even then, voices of dissent existed. Philosophers, moralists, and later Christian preachers pointed to these excesses as warnings. A society that delights in humiliation destroys its own soul. And what of us today? Have we moved beyond such spectacles, or have they merely changed form? Publics. Executions may no longer fill the squares of Sicily, but humiliation still feeds power. Scandals exposed on screens, political leaders mocked or destroyed through the court of public opinion, vulnerable people exploited behind closed doors. All of these echo the same psychology that nailed Pelorus to his throne. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains. Consider how modern regimes still stage show trials and public punishments to terrify dissenters. Consider how prisons, militaries, and even workplaces sometimes turn intimacy and humiliation into weapons. Consider how the media, with its endless appetite for scandal, transforms downfall into spectacle for mass consumption. In every case, the message is the same as it was in ancient Sicily. Your dignity is fragile, and those in power can take it from you. This is why Pelorus matters. Not because his name is famous, it isn't, but because his story captures a truth that stretches across time. That when rulers lose their moral compass, when cruelty becomes ritual, when humiliation becomes entertainment, the cost is not only borne by the victim, it corrodes the entire society. The throne of fire consumes everyone eventually. And yet, the survival of his story offers another truth. Memory is resistance. Pelorus may have died in agony, but he was not erased. His execution was supposed to terrify and silence, but instead it became a tale repeated by Roman historians, philosophers, and now by us. It became a warning etched into cultural memory, proof that even the most silenced lives can shape history. So we end with the question that lingers across the centuries. If you had been in that crowd, watching a slave crowned and burned, what would you have done? Would you have cheered?